So firstly, as a broad question, why should donors and the wider development community focus on harnessing all resources for development?
Okay, so I think there are a number of reasons why it's important to to focus on wider resources. I think that the first reason is so the post-2015 agenda is kind of placing an emphasis on domestic drivers for the agenda, for the implementation of the agenda. And if you look at developing countries and the resources that they have available to them, you see that there are some quite clear and well-evidenced shortfalls. So if you look at the resources available to government, for example, we've been doing some work in our Investments to End Poverty report, looking at government expenditure per capita, and some of the shortfalls, some of the numbers are quite stark. So many governments have very low levels of domestic resources. So for example, there are 1 billion people living in countries where government expenditure is less than $1,000 per person per year. 380 million people living below $1.25 a day live in countries where government expenditure is less than $500 per person per year. So these numbers are very low when you look at the responsibilities available to accredited to government. So it's clear that there are shortfalls in the resources available to domestic institutions. So the international community has a strong role to play in supporting domestic drivers for the post-2015 agenda looking forwards. So that's the first reason, that there are clear resource constraints, and the international community has a role to play in easing those constraints. I think that also it's important to look at harnessing resources beyond the traditional subset that we look at, because of the increasing complexity of the resource landscape. So the resources flowing to developing countries and available to developing countries have changed very significantly since the MDGs were agreed in 2000. So FDI, remittances, loan disbursements, philanthropic giving, other official flows, these have all grown in volume and in diversity. So there's a larger number of resources and actors and institutions involved in development. So within that context, it's important that ODA is situated within that context, but also works to its comparative advantage to mobilise and catalyse these other resources. So I think that's the kind of second reason.
Thank you. And so what would you say then are the challenges for donors in supporting the greater use of domestic and other resources, particularly in the context of the current MDGs and the post-2015?
The challenges. So I think that the biggest challenge is that the post-2015 agenda is, and rightly should be, very ambitious. And the biggest challenge on implementation is mobilising resources that are commensurate with that ambition. So really we're talking about large scale increases here. So I think that's a big challenge, mobilising wider resources and harnessing the contributions of different resources in different ways, and the contributions of different actors to support those goals. I think that there are many challenges there in mobilising domestic resources and in experimenting with different models and different instruments and policies for providing finance and additional contributions, and doing that within a framework of maintaining developmental focus, as many of these other resources aren't primarily focused on development, but also maintaining transparency and accountability principles.
Thank you. Why is a data revolution needed, and what is the value of transparency?
So I think there have been very strong calls from the high-level panel and from many actors involved for a data revolution, and it really is essential. If you look at the quality of the data available to us, you see that it's very poor. So if to take ending poverty, for example, which is likely to be the kind of primary goal, we've got halfway there with the MDG, but we need to finish the job. And if you take that aim to end $1.25 a day poverty and look at the quality of the information that we have on that, you see it's quite shocking, really, that we don't really know much about the problem that we're aiming to solve, in that the survey methodologies are inconsistent often and untimely. I'm trying to say we don't necessarily have a clear picture of the problem that we're addressing in $1.25 a day poverty. And also on the other side, we don't have a clear picture of the resources that are available to combat it. So while we have a relatively good picture of ODA, other resources which are much larger and flowing in much larger volumes, we know very little about what they're doing, how they're being spent, the subnational locations they're being spent in, the reverse flows and kind of repayment burdens that many of them generate. So data is essential in kind of understanding that picture and in it's a fundamental link in the chain for mobilising resources effectively. The quality of decision making that we take around mobilising resources is constrained by the quality of the data that it's based on. If you want good decision making, you need good information to feed into it. And data also underpins transparency. So that was the second part of your question. I think that transparency is fundamental for accountability and for making effective decisions. So it's very hard to hold an institution to account if you don't know what they're doing, if they're not transparent about what they're doing. It's very hard as institutions to coordinate effectively and work together in partnerships, and the post-2015 framework is placing increasing emphasis on partnerships. But it's very hard to do that if institutions aren't transparent with one another and they don't know what each other are doing. And then it's in an increasingly diverse resource landscape in which we're ambitiously aiming to mobilise wider resources. We're going to need to kind of experiment with different models. There is experimentation going on already with different models of financing and different models of contributing towards of implementation. And we need transparency in doing that in order to ensure that we get accurate results from that experimentation and that learning is shared, but also to ensure that new models of financing kind of maintain the developmental focus that they're there for, and also maintain underpinning the accountability principles again.
Well, next year ECDPM, along with many partners, will be producing the European Report on Development, which will focus very much on how to finance the post-2015 MTGs. There's been a lot of sessions this year's European Development Days looking at blending as a European finance option for development. What are your initial thoughts on some of the sessions you've been to on that as an interesting
on blending? So this has been one of the kind of more hotly debated issues at the Development Days, I think, over the last couple of days. I think in theory it's a very there's a lot of potential there to mobilise, to use kind of scarce ODA resources or developmental focused resources to mobilise much larger volumes of other resources. I think that so the EU has a blending platform, and there was a lot of debate around this yesterday. And I think that in general the principles of maintaining a developmental focus and maintaining kind of accountability are fundamental to these and other models. And I think that there's probably a way to go with that in some of the models that have been discussed here. But I think there's a lot of potential, but we need to kind of maintain those principles when trying out blending and when trying out other similarly innovative models.
Thank you.
All right.
That's all my questions. All right.